The first day at the Zandralis Academy of Excellence was everything Steve had feared and more. He stood at the entrance of the sprawling complex, dwarfed by its grand arches and shimmering towers that seemed to pierce the alien sky. The Academy was renowned across the galaxy for producing the best minds, warriors, and leaders, but it was also infamous for its grueling standards. The sheer size and scope of the place were overwhelming, but what unnerved Steve most was the gathering crowd of his new classmates. Steve's human form stood out sharply against the imposing figures around him. The Zandralis Academy accepted students from hundreds of different species, each chosen for their exceptional abilities. Towering reptilian beings with scales that glittered like polished metal stood shoulder to shoulder with massive quadrupeds, whose every movement seemed to make the ground tremble. A feathered avian alien with a wingspan that could block the sun swooped down gracefully, folding her vibrant wings as she landed among the crowd. Steve's small, wiry frame felt painfully out of place. As he moved through the group, he could feel eyes on him unblinking, curious and skeptical. Conversations quieted as he passed, whispers bubbling up in his wake. He didn't have to hear the words to know what they were saying. What is a human doing here? The thought wasn't new to him. Steve had asked himself the same question 1,000 times since receiving his acceptance notice. The entrance ceremony began with the booming voice of a Zandralis instructor, a hulking being covered in crystalline armor that glowed faintly with every word. "Welcome, future leaders of the galaxy," he announced, his voice echoing across the marble courtyard. "You are here because you represent the best of your kind. Strength, intelligence, resilience, these are the qualities that will be tested here. Only the exceptional will thrive." His glowing eyes swept over the crowd, pausing briefly on Steve, who tried to avoid his gaze. After the ceremony, the students were herded into the training arena, a colossal dome where the first physical assessments would take place. Steve's stomach churned as he stepped inside. The arena was filled with massive training equipment boulders that looked immovable, bars weighted with alien metals, and obstacle courses that stretched high into the sky. It all looked designed for giants, which, Steve supposed, many of his classmates were. "First test basic strength assessment," the instructor announced, gesturing toward a line of oblong stones resting on the ground. "These are standard training weights used across the galaxy. Every student must lift one to demonstrate their base strength." Steve swallowed hard. The stones varied in size, but even the smallest one looked formidable. As the instructor explained the procedure, Steve's attention was drawn to a group of reptilian aliens nearby. One of them, a particularly massive creature with gleaming emerald scales, glanced in his direction and smirked. Steve recognized the look instantly. It was the universal language of condescension. The reptilian alien leaned toward his companions, speaking just loudly enough for Steve to hear. "Is that a human? I thought this was a school for the strong. Did they let him in by mistake?" The group erupted into low, guttural laughter. Steve clenched his fists, his face burning with a mix of anger and embarrassment. He had dealt with this before, back on Earth, where people doubted his abilities because of his size. But here, among beings who could crush him with a flick of their tail or a swipe of their claws, the stakes felt impossibly higher. One by one, the students stepped forward to lift the weights. The reptilian alien who introduced himself loudly as Zorak approached one of the largest stones with exaggerated confidence. "Watch and learn," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. He bent down, gripping the stone with his clawed hands, and with a mighty roar, hoisted it above his head. The crowd cheered as Zorak tossed the stone to the ground with a thunderous crash, puffing out his chest as if he had just conquered a planet. Steve's turn came far too quickly. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of every eye in the arena. The smallest stone, the one he had decided to try, suddenly seemed heavier than a planet. He bent down, wrapping his hands around its rough surface, and pulled with all his strength. His muscles strained, his breath came in ragged gasps, but the stone barely budged. He tried again, adjusting his grip and digging his heels into the ground, but it was no use. From behind him, Zorak's voice rang out, mocking and loud. "Careful, human. You might pull a muscle, or worse, break something." Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp and biting. Steve straightened, his face hot with shame, and stepped back, letting the next student take his place. He avoided looking at anyone as he returned to the group, but the sting of their derision clung to him like a second skin. The rest of the assessment passed in a blur. Steve went through the motions, but his mind was consumed by doubt. He had known this would be hard, but he hadn't expected to feel so utterly outclassed. By the time the assessments were over, the instructor was tallying scores, and Zorak was basking in the admiration of his peers. Steve stood at the edge of the group, feeling smaller than ever. As the students were dismissed for the day, Steve lingered behind, staring at the weight he had failed to lift. The arena was quiet now, the echoes of laughter fading into silence. He approached the stone again, crouching down and gripping its surface. He pulled with everything he had, his muscles screaming in protest, but the stone remained unmoved. "It's not about strength," a voice behind him said. Steve turned to see one of the instructors watching him, their crystalline form shimmering in the dim light. "You think this is a test of brute force, but it's more than that. Strength takes many forms. You just need to find yours." The instructor's words echoed in Steve's mind long after they left. As he walked back to his quarters, he resolved not to let the day's failure define him. The road ahead was going to be long and hard, but he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Little did he know, the moment that would change everything was just around the corner. Steve's first night at Xandrelis Academy was restless. As he lay on the cold, metallic bed in his quarters, his mind replayed the events of the day in an endless loop. The laughter, the whispers, and Zorak's taunting smirk all echoed in his thoughts, amplifying his sense of inadequacy. He had known this would be hard, but he hadn't anticipated just how out of place he would feel among the galaxy's best and strongest. For the 100th time, he questioned whether he belonged here at all. The next morning, Steve awoke to the sound of the Academy's piercing alarm tone, a sharp, vibrating hum that rattled through the walls. He groaned, his muscles still sore from the previous day's assessments, and dragged himself out of bed. Outside his quarters, the hallways buzzed with activity as students prepared for the day's training. Steve kept his head down, avoiding eye contact as he joined the stream of aliens heading toward the training arena. Today's trial, as announced by the crystalline instructor, was a group challenge. "Strength is important," the instructor said, their voice resonating like a bell, "but no one succeeds in isolation. Today you will work together to achieve a common goal. Your task is to move a series of weighted boulders from one end of the arena to the other. Teamwork and strategy are essential." Steve's stomach twisted as the instructor began dividing the students into teams. He was placed with 3 other Zorak, whose smug expression immediately made Steve feel unwelcome. Kayla, a tall, elegant alien with feathered appendages that shimmered in the light, and Rulon, a bulky, quadrupedal creature with tusks and a low, rumbling voice. As the team gathered, Zorak made no attempt to hide his displeasure. "Great," Zorak muttered, crossing his muscular arms. "We're stuck with the human. This should be fun." Steve bit back a retort, knowing it would only make things worse. Kayla, sensing the tension, spoke up. "Let's just focus on the task. We don't have time for bickering." Her voice was calm but firm, and Zorak reluctantly fell silent. The challenge began with the sound of a loud gong, and the team sprang into action. The boulders they were tasked with moving were enormous, even larger than the training weights from the previous day. Each team had to transport their boulders across a rugged terrain filled with obstacles, pits, ramps, and uneven ground. Zorak took charge immediately, barking orders as if he were the team leader. "Kayla, you take the left side. Rulon, you push from the back. I'll handle the heavy lifting. And you," he turned to Steve, his tone dripping with disdain, "just stay out of the way." Steve clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't deny that Zorak's raw strength and confidence seemed better suited for the task. Reluctantly, Steve positioned himself at the side of the boulder, ready to assist wherever he could. The first few meters were grueling. The boulder was unbelievably heavy, and the uneven ground made every step a struggle. Zorak grunted as he pushed, his massive arms straining with effort. Rulon used his powerful legs to add momentum, while Kayla helped guide the boulder around obstacles. Steve did his best to contribute, but it was clear that his efforts were minimal compared to the others. As the team approached the first major obstacle, a steep ramp leading to a higher section of the arena, Zorak called for a break. "All right, let's think this through," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "We'll need to push harder to get it up the ramp. Rulon, you'll take the lead and pull from the front. Kayla and I will push from behind. Human, just try not to get in the way." Steve felt a surge of anger at Zorak's dismissive tone but swallowed it down. Instead, he focused on the problem at hand. The ramp was steep and slick, and it was clear that brute force alone wouldn't be enough to get the boulder to the top. He studied the terrain, his mind racing for a solution. "Wait," Steve said, stepping forward. The others turned to look at him, Zorak with an expression of annoyance. "What if we use the smaller stones over there to create a path? If we place them like steps, we can roll the boulder up instead of trying to push it all at once." Zorak scoffed. "Seriously? You think stacking rocks is going to help? We don't have time for this." Kayla, however, tilted her head thoughtfully. "It might work," she said. "The smaller stones could reduce the angle of the ramp and make it easier to move the boulder." Rulon rumbled in agreement, his deep voice resonating like distant thunder. "It's worth a try." Grudgingly, Zorak relented, and the team set to work gathering smaller stones from the surrounding area. Steve directed the placement, arranging them in a staggered pattern to create a makeshift staircase. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best they could manage with the materials available. When the path was ready, the team positioned themselves around the boulder once more. This time, the task felt slightly less daunting. As they pushed, the boulder rolled onto the first stone, then the next, gaining height with each step. The effort was still immense, but the makeshift path distributed the weight more evenly, allowing the team to make steady progress. By the time they reached the top of the ramp, everyone was panting and drenched in sweat. Even Zorak looked impressed, though he refused to admit it. "Not bad," he muttered under his breath. The rest of the trial continued in a similar fashion, with Steve offering small but effective strategies to overcome the obstacles they encountered. While Zorak remained skeptical, Kayla and Rulon began to respect Steve's contributions, recognizing that his intelligence and quick thinking were as valuable as raw strength. As the team neared the finish line, Steve felt a flicker of pride. For the first time since arriving at the academy, he felt like he had something to offer, but his moment of triumph was short-lived. The final obstacle loomed ahead, a massive chasm with only a narrow bridge spanning the gap. The boulder would have to be rolled across the bridge without tipping over the edge. Zorak frowned, clearly uncertain. "This is going to be tricky. If we lose our balance, it's over." Steve studied the bridge, his mind working furiously. The bridge was just wide enough for the boulder, but the slightest miscalculation could send it tumbling into the abyss. "We'll need to stabilize it as we move," he said. "Kayla and I can guide it from the sides while you and Rulon push from the back." Zorak hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But if this goes wrong, it's on you." With careful coordination, the team began moving the boulder onto the bridge. Every step was painstakingly slow, the weight of the boulder causing the bridge to creak ominously. Steve's heart pounded as he held his position, using every ounce of strength to keep the boulder steady. Kayla's feathered arms extended to provide additional support, while Zorak and Rulon pushed with measured force. At one point, the boulder wobbled dangerously, and Steve's breath caught in his throat. "Steady," he shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. The team adjusted their positions, and the boulder stabilized. Inch by inch, they moved it across the bridge until, finally, it reached solid ground on the other side. As the boulder settled into place, the gong sounded again, signaling the end of the trial. The team collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but triumphant. For the first time, Steve saw a glimmer of respect in Zorak's eyes. Not bad. For a human, Zorak said grudgingly. Steve smiled, his confidence renewed. He had proven that he wasn't just a liability, he was a valuable member of the team. And though he knew the road ahead would still be full of challenges, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The energy in the academy was electric after the group challenge. Whispers about Steve's unexpected contribution began circulating among the students, though they were often mixed with skepticism. Some were impressed by his ingenuity, others, like Zorak, dismissed it as luck. For Steve, however, the small victory had lit a spark. For the first time, he felt like he could hold his own in this alien environment. But he also knew that one moment of success wasn't enough to erase the doubts of his peers or his own. The next morning, Steve arrived at the training arena early, determined to practice before the others arrived. The arena was quiet, bathed in the pale blue light of the academy's artificial dawn. Steve approached the smaller training weights, the same ones he had failed to lift on his first day. He wrapped his hands around one of the stones and pulled, his muscles straining. The stone shifted slightly but refused to budge any further. Frustrated, Steve stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "You're wasting your time," a familiar voice drawled. Steve turned to see Zorak leaning against a pillar, his arms crossed and a smirk plastered across his face. "You can't brute force your way to strength, human. You'll never be one of us." Steve's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Maybe I don't need to be like you. Maybe I just need to be better at being me." Zorak's smirk faltered for a moment before he let out a mocking laugh. "We'll see how far that gets you," he said, turning to leave. "Good luck, human. You'll need it." Despite Zorak's taunts, Steve continued his practice. He focused not on trying to match the raw strength of his classmates, but on finding ways to maximize his own abilities. He experimented with techniques he had learned on Earth: leverage, balance, and precision. Slowly, he began to see progress. The weights he once struggled to move now shifted under his efforts, and his confidence grew with each small victory. Later that day, the students gathered in the arena for the next challenge. The crystalline instructor stood before them, their glowing form radiating an air of authority. "Today's trial," they announced, "is a test of individual strength and resilience. Each of you will attempt to lift the stone of origins." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. The Stone of Origins was legendary within the Academy, a massive relic said to weigh more than 10 times the average strength of the Academy's strongest students. It was used not as a realistic expectation, but as a way to measure determination and ingenuity. Few had ever succeeded in moving it even an inch. Steve's heart sank as the instructor gestured toward the stone. It was even larger than he had imagined. A monolithic slab of polished obsidian that shimmered with an otherworldly glow. Around him, the other students whispered excitedly, many of them eyeing the stone with a mix of awe and trepidation. The first student to step forward was a towering quadruped named Thurok. With muscles rippling beneath his thick hide, Thurok approached the stone confidently. He bent down, gripping its edges with his massive hands, and let out a guttural roar as he attempted to lift it. The stone trembled slightly but remained firmly on the ground. After several failed attempts, Thurok stepped back, his breathing heavy, and the crowd applauded politely. One by one, the students took their turns. Some managed to shift the stone slightly, while others couldn't budge it at all. Zorak was among the last to step forward. The crowd fell silent as he approached, his confidence palpable. With a dramatic flourish, he gripped the stone and pulled, his powerful muscles straining against its weight. The stone moved just barely, but it was enough to draw cheers from the crowd. Zorak stepped back, basking in the applause, and shot Steve a smug look. Finally, it was Steve's turn. The arena grew quiet as he stepped forward, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, their expectations low. Taking a deep breath, he approached the stone and crouched down, studying its surface. He ran his hands over the polished obsidian, feeling for imperfections, for anything he could use to his advantage. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. He remembered the instructor's words from his first day: strength takes many forms. He couldn't outmuscle the others, but perhaps he didn't need to. Instead of relying on brute force, he focused on his technique. He positioned his hands carefully, using his legs to generate leverage, and began to lift. At first, nothing happened. The stone was impossibly heavy, its weight pressing down on him like a mountain. Steve gritted his teeth, adjusting his stance and shifting his weight. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stone began to rise. A murmur ran through the crowd as they realized what was happening. Steve's muscles burned with the effort, his vision blurring as he focused every ounce of strength and determination into the lift. The stone rose higher, until it was fully off the ground. The arena erupted into stunned silence, followed by scattered applause that quickly grew into a deafening roar. As Steve set the stone down carefully, he staggered back, his body trembling with exhaustion. The crowd was on its feet, cheering and shouting his name. Even the crystalline instructor seemed impressed, their glowing eyes fixed on him with what looked like approval. Zorak, however, was less enthusiastic. His face was a mask of disbelief and barely concealed anger. He stormed forward, pointing a clawed finger at Steve. He cheated. Zorak shouted, his voice echoing across the arena. There's no way a human could lift that stone without trickery. The instructor raised a hand, silencing the crowd. There was no cheating, they said, their voice calm but firm. Steve used intelligence and technique to accomplish what others could not. Strength is not only a matter of muscle, it is also a matter of will and ingenuity. Zorak opened his mouth to argue but seemed to think better of it. He turned and stalked away, his tail lashing angrily behind him. Steve watched him go, a mix of relief and satisfaction washing over him. For the first time, he felt like he had truly proven himself. As the crowd began to disperse, Kayla approached him, her feathered appendages shimmering in the light. That was incredible, she said, her voice warm with admiration. You've shown everyone that humans are more than they seem. Steve smiled, exhaustion and pride mingling in his expression. Thanks, he said. But I think I've still got a lot to prove. Kayla tilted her head, studying him thoughtfully. Maybe. But today you proved something important not just to them, but to yourself. As Steve left the arena, the weight of the stone still lingering in his muscles, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come to Zandralis Academy as an outsider, an underdog, but now he knew he belonged. And though the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, he was ready to face them head-on. The aftermath of the Stone of Origins trial lingered in the air like the hum of a distant storm. Steve had returned to his quarters exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time since arriving at Zandralis Academy, he felt like he belonged. Yet, the triumph didn't erase the underlying tension, particularly with Zorak, whose anger and disbelief during the trial had made Steve's victory bittersweet. The next morning, the academy was abuzz with whispers. Steve felt their eyes on him as he walked to the training grounds, but the stares felt different now, less mocking, more curious, even respectful. He caught snippets of conversations as he passed. Did you see him? The human actually lifted it. How did he do it? Was it some kind of earth trick? He didn't just lift it, he did it with technique. That's something none of us thought of. The attention was strange, but Steve tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the day ahead. He had proven something to himself and to the academy, but deep down he knew the battle for respect wasn't over, especially with Zorak. As if on cue, the towering reptilian alien appeared in the corridor, his emerald scales catching the morning light. His gaze locked on Steve, and for a moment, Steve braced for another confrontation. Instead, Zorak said nothing. He simply sneered and walked past, his tail flicking with irritation. Steve exhaled slowly, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. He knew this wasn't the end of their rivalry. Later that day, the students were called to the central arena for their final trial of the week. The crystalline instructor stood before them, their glowing form radiating authority as they addressed the gathered crowd. Today's challenge will test more than strength or intelligence, the instructor began, their voice echoing across the arena. "It will test your ability to work together under pressure, a skill that is vital for success in the galaxy." The trial was simple in concept but daunting in execution. Each team would face a simulated crisis. A massive object designed to replicate a crashing spacecraft had to be moved across treacherous terrain to a safe zone before an impending explosion. The object was enormous, even larger than the Stone of Origins, and weighed enough that no single team member could move it alone. Success would depend on coordination, strategy, and trust. Steve's heart sank when he saw the team assignments. Once again, he was paired with Zorak, Kayla, and Rulon. The latter two offered him encouraging nods, but Zorak's expression was thunderous. "This is ridiculous," Zorak growled as the team gathered to discuss their plan. "We should have been given a stronger team. Instead, we're stuck babysitting the human again." "Enough," Zorak, Kayla said sharply. "We all saw what Steve is capable of yesterday. Maybe if you stopped focusing on his weaknesses, you'd notice his strengths." Zorak snorted but said nothing, his disdain clear. Steve stayed quiet, focusing instead on the task. The object was shaped like a massive cylinder, its surface studded with glowing panels that indicated its countdown to explosion. The terrain was a nightmare: uneven ground, narrow passages, and steep inclines that would test even the strongest teams. As the trial began, Zorak took the lead, barking orders. "Kayla, scout ahead and find the easiest path. Rulon, you push from the back. I'll handle the heavy lifting. Human, just..." "Stop," Steve interrupted, his voice firm. Zorak's eyes widened in surprise, but Steve pressed on. "If we're going to succeed, we need to work together. That means listening to everyone's ideas, including mine." Zorak hesitated, his pride clearly warring with his instincts. Finally, he growled, "Fine. What's your plan, human?" Steve stepped forward, pointing to the object. "It's not just about strength. We need to control its movement, especially on the inclines and narrow sections. Kayla, your wings can help stabilize it from above. Rulon, your strength will be crucial on the straight sections, but we'll need to alternate pushing and pulling to conserve energy. Zorak, you're strong, but if you exhaust yourself too soon, we'll fail. Take the lead. But pace yourself." There was a tense pause as the group absorbed his words. To Steve's relief, Kayla nodded immediately. "It makes sense," she said. "Let's do it." Rulon rumbled his agreement, and after a moment, Zorak grudgingly nodded. "Fine. But if this fails, it's on you." The trial was grueling from the start. The object was incredibly heavy, its bulk making it difficult to maneuver. The first stretch was relatively flat, but the uneven ground caused the cylinder to wobble dangerously. Kayla hovered above, using her wings to steady it, while Rulon and Zorak pushed from opposite sides. Steve positioned himself near the front, calling out adjustments to keep the object balanced. As they approached the first incline, the team faced their first major challenge. The slope was steep, and the risk of the object rolling backward was high. Steve quickly devised a plan. "Rulon, anchor yourself at the base to prevent it from sliding. Zorak and I will push from the sides to guide it upward. Kayla, keep it steady from above." The plan worked, though it pushed everyone to their limits. Zorak grunted with effort, his powerful muscles straining, while Steve used every ounce of strength to keep the object on course. By the time they reached the top, the team was panting and drenched in sweat. The final stretch was the most perilous. A narrow passage with jagged edges loomed ahead, and the glowing panels on the object flashed more urgently, signaling the countdown's end. Zorak's frustration boiled over. "We're running out of time. We need to move faster." "No," Steve said firmly. "If we rush, we'll lose control. Stay focused." Zorak glared at him but didn't argue. The team moved cautiously through the passage, with Steve and Kayla guiding the object from above and the sides. As they emerged into the open, the safe zone was in sight, but the countdown was dangerously close to zero. With a final burst of effort, the team pushed the object into the designated area just as the timer hit zero. The simulated explosion was replaced by a triumphant chime, signaling their success. The arena erupted into applause as the instructors stepped forward, their glowing eyes surveying the team. "Well done," the instructor said. "This trial was not just a test of strength but of unity and trust. Each of you played a vital role, and together you achieved what no one could alone." Steve felt a swell of pride as the instructor's words sank in. But the most surprising moment came when Zorak stepped forward. The towering reptilian alien looked at Steve, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Steve thought Zorak might say something dismissive, but instead, he extended a clawed hand. "You proved me wrong, human," Zorak said, his voice grudging but sincere. "You're stronger than I thought." Steve hesitated, then took Zorak's hand, shaking it firmly. "We're stronger together," he said simply. That night, as Steve sat on the balcony of his quarters, he reflected on the journey so far. He had come to Zandralis Academy feeling like an outsider, outmatched and out of place. But now, he realized that his strength wasn't just in his muscles, it was in his mind, his determination, and his ability to bring others together. For the first time, Steve felt like he truly belonged. And as he looked up at the alien stars above, he knew that this was only the beginning of his journey.